The central element of working in a generative relationship is to recognize that today the role and use of technology has changed significantly. The actual technologies themselves have changed significantly. And what companies are seeking from technology have changed significantly. The old model of taking a single product and selling it to multiple customers is actually fostering commoditization because it's market-based solutions for customer-defined problems as opposed to creating sources for revenue and growth.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Growth Hacks, a podcast from TCV where we discuss strategies and secrets to unlocking high growth with CMOs, CROs, and growth-minded leaders. I'm Kunal Mehta, and I'm a principal at TCV focused on go-to-market strategy.
And I'm Katja Gagan, principal at TCV and head of marketing. Join us as we bring you the growth and marketing playbooks from technology's best and brightest, and chat with operators as they are in the process of innovating. This is Growth Hacks.
Hi, everyone, and please welcome Mark McDonald. He is Research Vice President and Gartner Fellow, leading multiple research areas, including the application of technology to business. Mark is most interested in blue flame companies that are really delivering value or co-creating value with their customers. Mark is a great speaker and appears regularly in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and CIO magazine. The great thing about Mark is he does not just think and write about stuff, but he also knows what he's talking about. He's held roles in commercial companies and has been implementing what he's been talking about. Mark, welcome to Growth Hacks.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
We've talked a lot with you, and you've covered and introduced a term that not all of our listeners may have heard, which is generative research. Can you explain to us, what do you mean by this term and why has it piqued your interest?
Generative really describes a new way of working between companies and their high-tech providers. It's really a new kind of engagement model. And to kind of understand what generative is, we have to go back to what the current or the dominant business model is in the high-tech industry, which we can call a defined model. Defined in the sense that a high-tech company defines a solution or a service and then markets that solution or service based upon its fit with customer needs. In other words, I have an answer and you have a question, and I'm trying to figure out how the two of them come together the right way. And these defined solutions are really expensive. They're an expensive way to create technology. They're expensive for the companies that buy the technology, who have to go through things like RFPs and RFIs, who oftentimes report that they get less business benefit than they originally thought. It's expensive for high-tech companies who have to market, sell, and serve pre-sales, post-sales, expenses associated with it. That really leads the tech industry to have the second highest SG&A costs of all the other major industries. There's a lot of cost tied up in that defined solution model. But generative is a different approach. Generative really describes the way that companies come together with their customers to create new sources of value. And one of the phrases we kept hearing when we were doing the initial research was, in a generative relationship, we built things together that probably would not exist if either one of us built it on their own. So it's that combination of coming together in new ways, in more open and expansive views, that differentiate themselves from the predefined model of kind of, I've got my solution, I'm going to configure it and make it fit, that really differentiates generative from the way most high-tech companies run today.
I think what you're saying is critically important, Mark, in terms of how to be generative. The way I'm hearing it, a customer, a technology provider, or a partner may not individually have the best answer, but collectively, working together, they all have the best answer. Maybe you can walk through the challenges and the impact of partnering in a really generative way.
It's a great observation, Kunal. The central element of working in a generative relationship is to recognize that today, the role and use of technology has changed significantly. The actual technologies themselves have changed significantly. And what companies are seeking from technology have changed significantly, which basically says that the existing kind of defined model is running out of gas and actually creates commoditization as opposed to creating differentiation. So it starts with that notion that technology's highest and best use is now to drive revenue growth, much, much more than cost takeout or automation and integration. And if growth is the highest and best use of technology, then growth comes from creating and exploiting sources of competitive advantage. And so executives that say, I'm going to lead my business with technology, information and technology is going to help me create sources of comparative advantage, they go to the existing tech business model and it's lacking. It's too slow. Too much of the power and choice and pacing is done on the provider side, not on my side. And so they want to pay, they recognize and are willing to pay a premium for advanced technology, advanced solutions that are to their need, at their schedule, and to their strategy. Now, at the same time, we ran into high-tech companies who said, you know what, I'm looking for ways to create this advantage because I need to be able to create competitive advantage to avoid commoditization in this cloud and services environment. Surveys tell us that traditional competitive strengths like best-of-breed solutions and being an established vendor are of decreasing importance to tech buyers. And so the old model of taking a single product and selling it to multiple customers is actually fostering commoditization because it's market-based solutions for customer-defined problems as opposed to creating sources for revenue and growth. And really how those two things come together define what we mean by generative. And those are the challenges we think generative helps solve.
That's really interesting, Mark. And you actually interviewed a variety of companies and customers and investment firms as well as entrepreneurs. Walk us through how a company can think of becoming more generative in the future.
Well, there's three things that help tech companies and high-tech startups become generative. One is being focused on a business outcome. And I know you hear the term business outcome, but for many people, business outcome is a slogan. For a generative company, it's real. And so what we mean by that is, tell me kind of what's the future state you want to be in, either in terms of increased business performance or new business capabilities, etc., without having to tell me exactly how you're going to get there. And that's what we mean by business outcomes really extend that range of potential solutions. And in that range of potential solutions are sources of competitive advantage. The second piece, that you alluded to was the notion of kind of how we work together. And we see this in what we call a high quality relationship, where parties jointly commit to finding the answers for the company and are willing to share the risk and return associated with it. Generative high-tech providers or providers who have generative high-tech approaches in their business models use these relationships as accelerators for growth and margin. And really the last piece associated with it is this notion of having an unbounded view of technology. And this is what really differentiates companies that can create competitive advantage. Let me just give you an example. Think of a retailer that wants to be able to ship individual items to customers or to stores at a cost the same or lower than they would ship a whole truckload of goods to a distribution center or a warehouse. That's an example of an outcome. I don't know exactly how we're going to achieve that, but on an unbounded view of technology, I know the way we're not going to start with is to take up a tech provider's existing supply chain solution and try to tweak it to make it better. What we see in companies that are getting these breakthrough levels of performance and value creation is they go not back to basics so much as they come at it from an unbiased view, if you will. The business outcome defines the context. The relationship defines how we're going to work together and who's involved in working together to create this. And this unbounded view of technology gives us an open playing field to figure out what's the best set of advances we can use to go there forward. The last piece I'll mention to you that we keep seeing constantly among different providers on both the company side and on the high-tech side is kind of strange. It's humility. And what we mean by humility is that all parties recognize that the value in what they seek is so important that they know that they can't get it just by themselves. As one CEO said in relationship to one of his generative relationships for his company was, we recognized that in order to redefine the customer experience in our industry, we had some of the skills that were necessary, but we didn't have all of the skills that were necessary. So we wanted to find somebody who was willing to be as invested and as engaged about transforming the experience in our industry as we were, not people who had the same skills that we did, but people who had different skills. And that combination has created some pretty terrific stuff. And that's what humility is all about.
That's awesome, Mark. And I think in addition to being humble, being curious is probably another good trait to have.
I love the fact that you had humility as one of the key cornerstones. As you go through your own research, maybe you can walk through for our listeners the overall Gartner Research agenda.
Yeah, so Gartner's working on a lot of things, obviously trying to define the world as it continues to move forward beyond the initial hit of the pandemic. There's three things that Gartner's working on overall that I think are pretty interesting, one of which is this notion of composability, the technology and technical approaches associated with incorporating ideas like modularity, autonomy, orchestration, and discovering and learning cycles into the way people build technology and the way technology is managed. And that's been a major focus. Gartner continues to concentrate on the notion of digital acceleration, not digital transformation anymore, because that's kind of lost some of its punch, but rather the notion that we're now in a world that is going to be constantly digitally accelerating. And so what does that mean when digital change becomes continuous? The last piece of the top three things that Gartner's working on is the notion of ESG and the social impact of technology. This research started with the idea of if every company becomes a tech company, what's the future of high tech? But every society is becoming, technology and information intensive as well. That really continues to change the nature of our interactions, our values, and how society works. And that's another major research theme. Personally, I'm working on more new business models related to high-tech companies. We found an interesting thing in the generative research about intellectual property and how attitudes towards IP are changing. This came up when we were doing the generative research because obviously if two parties are coming together to create something new, something that has tremendous value and competitive advantage, one of the questions we got from other people as we were explaining this idea, they said it was, well, what happens with intellectual property? And what we found was really kind of curious, was that these generative companies have a significantly different view on IP than others do. And it's a view on IP that basically says my IP has greater value when it's put into motion as opposed to when it's kind of locked down in patents and licensing agreements, etc. And what piqued my interest in looking at this IP issue in more detail is that executives who were under the age of 50 had a much more liberal view of IP than executives who were over the age of 50 who thought that IP was something that needed to be protected and walled off. And so we're concentrating on that. And then obviously continuing to build down the next level of generative in terms of how does this model, work at deeper and deeper levels of detail.
Awesome. And Mark, we had a chance to talk to you at TCV about generative technology. We did a case study, actually. So what are your three key takeaways from that research?
Yeah, so we found three really interesting things as we had conversations with different people. The first one was recognizing that notion of growth being technology's job one, and that when I change the job of technology, I have to change my attitude towards technology. And I think Tim McAdam really said it best. The clearest way for a tech company to get a multi-billion-dollar market cap that's 20 or 30 times revenue is to provide a product that allows customers to transform their businesses and grow faster than the competition. Now, when you think about that, that's a very nuanced but incredibly powerful view that says my value as a tech company comes from creating the environment in which my customers can actually grow their business faster and better. So it's not like coming up with a killer tech or the killer app and flogging it forever. It's really saying, is I put myself and my technology at the center of my customer's business model and at the center of my customer's revenue generation, that's where I get significant growth. And I think that's really important because if you keep that growth focus, it keeps your eyes and your head, if you will, in the right game, which is about value creation. And too often when we talk to high-tech companies, particularly smaller high-tech companies, their focus is on the technology or their focus is on the company itself, which kind of is playing the wrong game. It's kind of an internal game that says our technology is better, so we should be winning in the marketplace, but we're not. And then you say, okay, well then what's the ethos behind the technology being used? And then this growth ethos that came out in TCV is a really great way of encapsulating that. I think the two other points that are important to recognize is the approach that y'all took relative to sustainable growth as an architectural and business issue. And I think that's really insightful as well. The view that architecture is important and your willingness to invest in your portfolio companies to get them towards an architecture that's services-based, that's modular, that's scalable, really reflects this notion of generative by saying, I'm creating a foundation that's adaptive. I'm creating a foundation that can, create things that we hadn't thought of before. And I think that's really essential to kind of finding high growth in this environment going forward. And then finally, the last piece, which was really impressive, which I think, again, represents kind of where things are going overall, is this notion of using information in combination with your qualitative experience of the partners and the people that work with your companies, but also the notion of saying we know, not just know in our bones, but also know because we have data from multiple companies about the challenges companies face, what companies have done in the past, and how companies are moving forward in the future. And I think it's that combination of that quantitative approach of leading a company with the qualitative approach that says we've been here, we understand the context, that again really reflects that notion of being unbounded and open. And so in those regards, one of the nice things was going through and talking with people at TCV was to see that those practices exist not just in the provisioning of tech, but also in the way companies create value for themselves.
Outstanding. Hey, Mark, just a quick question for our listeners. If I wanted to kind of engage with you on the generative agenda, or if I have something really interesting and want to run it by you, what do you recommend listeners do to get on your radar?
Well, there's two ways to do it. There's the kind of technical way, which would be to have them contact their Gartner sales representative. I'm also on LinkedIn. People can feel free to reach out to me via email at mark.mcdonald@gartner.com. I can't promise I'll answer every email. And if you're really just emailing me with a marketing message, then it'll take a little bit lower priority. But I'm happy to always talk and learn from other people doing this.
Fantastic. We usually end these podcasts with some rapid fire questions just to make sure our listeners have a little bit more context on who we're interviewing here. So I thought maybe you could start by telling us your favorite book.
Well, two of them. From a business book perspective, there's a book out called Backable by Sunil Gupta that I think everybody should read. It really talks about the factors that say, how do you get people to invest in you and commit their resources to you? On the fiction side, William Gibson's latest book called Agency is great, but probably my all-time most favorite book would be Cryptonomicron by Neil Stephenson. I know it's been around for a while, but it's still a really fabulous book.
That's awesome. I can't wait to get some of them. And a lot of people follow you on social media or follow your research, Mark. Who do you follow?
I kind of pay attention to Michael Lewis, who always seems to have an interesting twist and perspective on things. And then I watch and I follow Christopher Mims on the Wall Street Journal, who's really kind of a good bellwether for where corporate thinking is going relative to technology.
Fantastic. I love Michael Lewis's, not only his books, but you're right, he brings an incredible lens to really meaty topics. What kind of gets you intellectually curious?
A really good paradox, particularly one that if you can find a way to resolve it has a big impact. And so generative's like that. So how do you get bespoke results from a product or service supplier? And one of the things that I keep coming back to when somebody kicks an idea around is it like the notion of high quality, low cost? And there was a time when those two things were seen as completely opposite. You could not have high quality and low cost. And, they resolved Deming and other people resolved that paradox and really created breakthrough ideas. And that's what gets me intellectually curious.
Wonderful. And Kunal asked earlier about what people should do to get on your radar, but how do people miss the mark? What's your biggest pet peeve?
I think probably two big pet peeves. One is people who are not willing to engage in the challenge before the answer is really known. And I'm sure we've all met people who kind of hold back until they figure out which way the wind's blowing and then, suddenly jump on the winning side. The other pet peeve really is people who demand your attention without necessarily providing anything that's worthy of your attention. That's where a lot of people who are sending outbound marketing things, for example, saying we're the world's leading or we're the world's best, kind of like, okay, sure, but let's move on from there because everybody's the world's best at something.
Hey, Mark, I'm going to say a term and I'm going to ask you what it means to you. Emotive decision-making.
I don't know if it's a loaded term or not, but really getting excited about the potential of an option that you've chosen. If you say yes, and that's fine, but a real emotive decision goes that next step to say, I want to be part of it and I'm willing to contribute and commit to that. And that's what emotive decision means to me.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. We covered a lot, and most importantly, things related to value creation, which is something that is near and dear to TCV's heart and also a concept that we love about your generative research agenda, creating value with partners and customers together in a way that they couldn't do by themselves. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and also for instilling a dose of humility, curiosity, and partnership in everything you do.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Growth Hacks. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. To learn more about us and TCV's CEO and Founder podcast, go to tcv.com or email us at growthhacks@tcv.com.